Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping people take their leadership to the next level. Brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International.
Hey, welcome back to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. Richard, it's good to see you again.
Yes, we're getting to the end of the winter season of this series here.
Yeah, yeah. Winter is drawing near on this little mini series that we've been doing. If this is your first time tuning into our podcast, we've coming to the end of a series on the seasons of God, and it's based on the book that Richard wrote a few years back called The Seasons of God. And we'll have links for that in our show notes that you can take a look at that if you're interested. I think we'll probably even give some discounts if you get it through our website. Richard, well, before we get into winter, I would just encourage the listeners to go back a few episodes and catch up on our talks on spring and summer and fall. And then you'll be able to come straight into winter, as we're about to discuss here. So, Richard, tell us, what are maybe the signs of winter? We know in the natural world what winter looks like, but maybe in our life, in our work, in our leadership, what can we be looking for when winter's coming?
Well, as we know from nature, winter is about endings. It's a time where you may have had a beautiful flower garden all summer, but now those flowers have died. They're drooping. The leaves have fallen off the trees. There's snow on the ground.
Not here in Georgia, though.
Yeah, not typically here. But
No.
I did grow up in Canada, and I'm an expert in winter.
Snow. Yeah.
And winters were long, and they were cold. And you had ice and snow covering everything. And there was a bleakness, a desolateness. You didn't expect to see greenery. You didn't expect to see things growing, thriving. It was definitely a time of change, and that happens in life as well. It's a time of endings. It may be that you were laid off your job. It might be that your last child moves out of the house and now you have an empty nest. It might be that your spouse passes away, or maybe you go through a divorce. It could be any number of things where a major ending takes place. A major part of your life has come to an end. And we just don't like endings. We're not, for one, we're not really prepared for them, and we aren't taught how to handle them. In some sense, we feel like failures if something has come to an end on our watch. And it's a time of mourning at times. It's a time of grieving the loss of what we had before, what we knew how to handle. You know, it was our routine. It's what we were good at, and all of a sudden we can't do that anymore. And so winter is that. There's a verse in John 12, verse 24, where Jesus says, "Most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain. He who loves his life will lose it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life." And I think what Jesus was saying is that in the nature of the way God has created things, sometimes a healthy part of life is for things to die, for things to come to an end. Unless they die, then you can experience the life that will come afterward. And so I've found in working with people and coaching them that we struggle very much at this point. We're happy for God to do something new, but we're not very comfortable with letting go of the old.
Yeah.
But the fact is that winter is a time to bring an end to some things that may have been perfectly fine in times past, but in order for God to bring a new springtime, then he's got to bring winter first. He's got to remove some things. You know, I remember for 13 years, I was the president of a seminary in Canada. And many people looked at that as kind of the peak of my career. I'd been a pastor. Now I'm training pastors. I'm the head of a denominational entity. I travel around the world speaking, writing books, and it was a great job. It was in a great location. I sat at my desk and looked out on the Rocky Mountains. We lived in a beautiful town. My family loved it there. Everything was good. And then one day I just sensed that God was saying, I'm moving you on. I remember having a conversation with someone that, it was a friend, it was someone that cared about me, but at the end of the conversation, I just realized, I think God may be moving me on. And my heart's racing. It had never crossed my mind to leave that job. But God began to just impress upon me that my time there after 13 years was drawing to a close. And I did leave there. And, the interesting thing for me is that when I look back later, I realized that I had stopped growing in that job. Now, I don't think I had stopped growing as a person, but I had stopped growing in that job. I didn't feel like I needed to keep growing to do that job well. I knew how to do that job. And so I could just go into the next year and keep doing things with the same skills, the same abilities I had before. And what I've learned is that when you stop growing, you start dying. And I didn't need to grow anymore to do that job. And so now it doesn't mean that God, every time you get to that point, God's going to move you to a different job, but he will add a new dimension to your job, a new position, a new challenge, a new dynamic. But I've just seen too many people that stopped growing, but it was like they died, but they didn't have the funeral. So they're still in the job, but that's it. They're just putting in time, and they've got this many more years till they can retire, and they're just putting in time. And it's really a shame to waste life like that. And so what God said to me is, I for your sake, I need to give you a fresh challenge. You need a new springtime. The problem is that you have to release some things so that there's room for God to do something new. Henry Cloud wrote an interesting book called Necessary Endings. And he wrote it a year or so after I wrote the Seasons book. And he actually begins his book talking about seasons as well, and a very similar framework that I use. But he writes an interesting book because he says, we're not trained and equipped for endings. As I've said earlier, we're praised for beginnings. We're not praised for endings. And so we don't get training for that. We don't know how to measure when it's time to end something. So he says sometimes, for instance, relationships can stay too long. Maybe you're in a dating relationship and it's gone toxic and it's not building you up, but and you know that and you're frustrated by it, but you don't bring it to an end. You keep thinking, well, it's better than nothing, or I could do worse, or maybe things will turn around. You're in a job that you hate, but you could just quit. You could look for something else. You could go back to school, get some other skills. But instead, you just stay in a job that you hate. And so and sometimes you may be the boss and you have an employee that needs to be let go. You've talked to them, you've confronted them, you've given them training, you've sent them to workshops, but you keep getting the same negative behavior. And oftentimes when I talk to people in management, they'll acknowledge that they've got at least one person that probably needs to be let go. But you ask, well, why haven't you let them go yet? Well, don't want to hurt their feelings. I don't want the confrontation. Putting that off until after we get through this season.
Which usually leads into another season.
Yeah.
And there's always a season that you can delay that.
Yeah. And the problem is that a lot of people don't see that winter has set in, and they stay past their winter. I've known pastors like that. They may have started the church, and for years, the church was growing. It was dynamic. It was an exciting place to be. They were hiring some great staff people to work with them. But then at a certain point, you could see that things had plateaued, and now they were declining. Now, instead of growing, they're losing people. And that great staff that they had, they're starting to go and work in other churches, and they're leaving. And there's dissension and division for the first time. And everybody else can see that things have changed, that this leader is past his heyday, at least at that church. And at times it's bewildering well, why doesn't the pastor just leave? Why doesn't he find a new assignment? It's clear that his skills, his passion, his energy is not sufficient now to take the church to the next level, but they stay. And oftentimes they stay because they begin to identify that role as theirs. It belongs to them, or their church. I started this church, so I'm staying. Or nobody could handle it as well as me. Or we explain away and say, well, it's just, things have just changed in this community, or the economy is bad, or Satan has just really been having a heyday with this church. When the fact might be winter set in for you. And now the best thing you can do is to move on and let the next person come in with fresh vision, fresh passion, fresh ideas to build on what you've done. And the worst thing is when people don't recognize that winter has set in, so they stay too long. I remember a pastor one time inherited some clerical staff that at his church, and he had one woman that had been there a long time, was well paid, but she'd been hired back when they were still using basically manual typewriters, and she'd not kept up with the latest software and was struggling. But because she'd been there the longest, had the most seniority, she had the most important jobs. But she was becoming a bottleneck, and they would be waiting on reports and projects that she couldn't get done in time. And so she's feeling the pressure that they need all this from her and she can't produce. And so she's getting upset that they're demanding so much. And so she says, I need an assistant. I'm an assistant, but I need an assistant of my own to get all the work done. And eventually the pastor realized, well, no, it's just probably time for this woman to retire. All the signs were there that that her job had outgrown her. That it's not that she couldn't still work somewhere, but of course, when you're in harvest time, when you're at the top of your game, you're getting paid the most that you've ever been paid. So it's really hard to walk away from the best paying job you've ever had and say, you know what, I don't think I'm doing justice to this salary anymore. I need to downsize my job to something I can still handle. And so you stay. You stay for the money. You stay for the prestige. But she wasn't really getting the job done. And so she finally was asked to leave. And it's sad. I've seen this happen many times, where if a person had just recognized the season they were in, they could have, on their own initiative, said, I think it's time for me to retire from this job. They would have held a big party for them and celebrated their years of service, and everybody would have given gifts, and it would have been loving. But they kept staying. They kept staying. And ultimately, they were shown the door. Now they're resentful, they're humiliated, they're upset. They're going around telling people how ungrateful their employees are, that they've not appreciated all the work and sacrifice they've done. Well, interestingly, after that woman left, the church brought in about a 23-year-old young lady, hired her part-time, just half-time, and said, look, we're going to reorganize the whole office. We're going to change a lot of responsibilities. And so we're not quite sure how things will look right now. But for now, would you just take a look at this desk and sort through all the work on the desk and just do the most important things. Don't try to do it all. Just kind of tackle the most pressing issues, and we'll get back to you and let you know how this job will pan out. Well, by the end of the week, the young lady came back and said, what else do you have for me to do? And the pastor said, well, when you get the most important things done, just keep working through the pile. Just go to the next things. She said, well, I did that. I've finished the pile. I need more work to do. And it absolutely blew away her manager, because this manager had the longest serving tenured staff person feeling overwhelmed with her job and needing them to hire another full-time person just to help her do her work. But the problem was that winter had set in on that person, and they needed to have a necessary ending. But when they did finally get someone who had current skills and abilities and energy and passion and vision, they could do in half the time what someone else couldn't do full-time. And the problem is that there's a lot of churches, there's a lot of organizations that are carrying people that have moved past winter season in their life, and they haven't moved on. And because of that, it's hurting the organization. It's hurting that person, Because when you're in a job that you're not doing a good job of, that's demoralizing. That's dehumanizing. And you're not doing anyone any favors by carrying someone past what they're capable of doing. And especially if you're in a church, that means that people in the church are not getting the ministry they could have gotten if you had someone in the job that could do the job well. And so I think we owe it to people, we owe it to our organizations to recognize that when winter comes, it's time for a change.
Well, that raises some interesting questions. But first, let's take a quick break, and we'll get right back to it.
During this series, we want to offer our listeners an extra 10% off Richard's popular book, The Seasons of God, which can help you identify the changing seasons in your life. Go to blackabystore.org and use coupon code SEASONS at checkout for an extra 10% off your copy of The Seasons of God.
Well, I think it's quite clear that most people don't like endings.
Yeah.
We're not really meant for endings, I think, in a lot of ways. We're not prepared for endings. They're hard. So that begs the question, what advice do you have for someone who may be listening and is saying, I've never thought about it before, but maybe where I am right now in life, it's a winter time, and maybe I need to end some things in my life. What advice would you give?
Well, one thing is take an inventory of the various areas of your life that winter might be affecting. One could be in your time. Maybe you've served on the local private school board for the last 5 years, and you've gone to their meetings once a month, or you've served on a committee at your church or on your association or something. And just because you've done it, for a lot of us, once you get signed on, especially in a church activity, it's like a lifetime sentence. You're on for life now. They never come back and say, would you like to not be on this committee anymore? You're just there. And so before long, your life gets filled up with activities that were maybe fine to do for the first 5-6 years. But I would suggest that every year when you get to the end of the year, take time to go before God and say, God, I felt like you led me to serve here. I've done it for the last 5 years, but do you want me to do it a 6th year? We don't even ask those questions normally until we get burned out, until we just get overwhelmed. And you can save yourself getting burned out and overwhelmed if every year you say, God, has winter set in yet on this activity? Here's an interesting one. And you have to be real careful with this. You have to just kind of think about this. But I think sometimes even relationships have seasons to them. And so you may have, for instance, had preschool kids, and you made friends with another couple who also have preschool kids, and you had a lot in common, and you did a lot together. You might have gone on outings together and had gone over to each other's homes and stuff. But people change, and people go in different directions. And one day you realize, I have not gotten with that friend in months. It's been over a year. We haven't even had lunch together. We used to be together at least once a week, and I feel like a terrible friend that I've just neglected this person, and we can feel really guilty about that. Well, what happens sometimes is that God uses friendships and relationships in order to equip us and help us in areas where we need help. And if I were God and I wanted to introduce change in your life, one of the best ways I could do it is to introduce a new relationship in your life. Someone that saw things differently than you did, maybe had some skills or insights, or maybe they introduced you into some new activities that you'd never done. And so what happens, though, is our life gets consumed with, we never end a relationship. So in time, our life is full, it's overflowing with relationships. And so even if we wanted a new friend, we wouldn't have time for them. And I live in the South, and it's interesting to me a lot of times in the South, it's still a little bit more stable than, say, the West is in terms of people living there a long time. And so, you go to church on a Sunday, and you have a greet time, and you meet someone, and they seem very friendly and nice at the church. And you think to yourself, hey, we just moved into the area. Would you like to go for lunch and after church? And this nice couple says, oh, that sounds wonderful. But, for years, we've always gone to the grandparents for church, for Sunday lunch, and all the relatives are there. And so, sorry, we're just not available for that. And then you discover that this nice couple, the wife still gets together for lunch with her best friends from high school. And, she graduated 20 years ago, but they've got these long time relationships. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to have long time relationships, but there are times where if all of a sudden it just naturally begins to drift apart and you realize, that person has gotten really negative. They used to be such a positive influence in my life, but now they're just very negative, or they're just so consumed with all their concerns that they don't really have time for me. Or I just say all that to say, look at every aspect of your life, maybe even a hobby that you've had. Maybe God wants you to develop a new friendship, and he's going to have to remove a couple of kind of stagnant relationships in your life so that there's now space for a new relationship. You've got time now. Maybe you got to end 3 of your volunteer positions so that now you've got room for a new one. So the Bible says, we saw in Ecclesiastes 1, everything has a season to it. So that means that every area of your life has a season. Nothing's meant to just be forever. Especially when you go into a new year, take time to ask yourself, has winter set in on this relationship, this commitment, this hobby, this activity? Maybe God wants to make some room so that I can have a new springtime where God introduces some great new things in my life in the days to come.
Yeah, and I think something that you mentioned earlier was the fact that other people that are around you can sometimes see the seasons changing in your life before you even can.
Yeah.
And I think that's such an important part of this, because I think it's much easier to recognize the changing seasons in other people's life or ministry or job or whatever than it is to sometimes recognize it in our own life.
One other thing, I think you're right, and I think I shared that my wife, probably the last 3 major job changes I've had, my wife knew before I did that I needed to make them.
Yeah.
And I just didn't see it. But, one other thing I just say about winter is people sometimes say, well, how long does the winter have to last? Like, it's painful. Does this have to go on for years? And of course, I think we both know people that have spent years in winter.
Yeah.
They got laid off of a job and that they'd worked at for 15 years, and they went 3 years in a funk, unemployed, looking for work, feeling terrible about themselves and about the people that laid them off, or someone went through a divorce, or they became a widow, and for years they grieved and bemoaned their fate and genuinely just missed what they had, and so people will say, I mean, do you have to go through years of that? And I would say,
how long does? What can I set my calendar to say? Okay,
it seems like sometimes springtimes are way too brief and winter is way too long. But
well, certainly in Canada.
Yeah, but what I would say about that is that winter doesn't have to necessarily last a long time, but there's certain things that need to happen in winter. If you're like a farmer and you've brought the harvest in, there needs to be a time of rest. There needs to be a time to celebrate what went on in the past. There needs to be a time to reflect and say, but going into the next year, what do I think I need to do differently? What changes do I need to make? There's a way to prepare for what's coming next. What I find sometimes is that we don't utilize winter very well. So, like, for instance, maybe you got laid off of a job, and now you're just fretting. I got to get work. I've got to get a job. So you're worried, and you're reading the newspaper every day, and you're a nervous wreck, and all you can do is focus on that. And so, sure enough, maybe 6 months, maybe a year later, but now you're in a perfect job. It's great. Everything's fine. I can't tell you how many people have come to me and said, Richard, if I had known that this job was coming, I would have done things so much differently in that time. I could have taken a class and picked up a skill. I could have finished off a degree. I could have gone on a mission trip with my son. I could have spent more time with family. I could have read a couple of Christian classics. I could have utilized that winter season and improved and grown and been so much better and better equipped for a better job. But instead, I worried and fretted and frittered away that winter season way too long. And, sometimes I've known people that went through a bitter breakup, and they just nursed their bitterness and the unfairness of it all. And how could they let me go? And how could they fire me after all I've done? And I just don't trust people, and I'm never going to work for someone like that again. And, They dwell upon it and nurse the bitterness, and so they don't get over it. They don't get past it. And so I would say, look, this is painful, and you need to process this, and it may not have been fair. But what can you learn from it? What is God teaching you? And what is God taking you from now? It may be that when you find the next job that you have, you'll be so grateful that you were let go, because now you're free to find a much better job. But so how you handle your winter, I think largely determines how long your winter lasts. And I've known people that, I knew a woman one time whose husband left her and divorced her. And it was very unkind. It was very ungodly, but she could not get over it. I mean, this woman could not get over it. And I mean, years later, she'd meet total strangers. She'd be at a restaurant and start telling the waitress about her jerky husband and what he did. And it was like, you've got to move on, woman. Like, all you want to talk about is you're consumed by your former husband. And no one wants to be around you. No one wants to be your friend, because they're just going to keep hearing the same vitriol just being spewed out of your mouth over and over again about the same person. And you can just stay there and just nurse winter for years, or you can say, I've been cut loose from a negative relationship in my life, and now I'm free to move on to the next springtime. But some people can't let go of that. And so they needlessly stay in winter way too long. Winter frees you in some ways for the next springtime. So don't see it as just a negative thing. If A did not end, you'd not have the freedom for B. And so B may not be the same as A. Life coming up may not be exactly like life was before. But it'll still be good, because like it says in Ecclesiastes 3:11, everything is beautiful in its time. And if you are now in a new time, look for the beauty in that time, and let God just show you the beauty of that. And don't live in the past. God doesn't want you to live in the past. That's not where you're going. You're going toward the future. So keep your eyes there and embrace the next season that God has for you, because if you'll just embrace whatever season God brings, it will be good too in its own way.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to end our talk on seasons, and look forward to what's coming up after this. And thank you guys for listening.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, review us on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. If you have questions or comments, please email us at podcast@blackaby.org.